Hello, this is the first video lecture for ECON320, so please, after you finish watching it, let me know how I can improve my videos, whether some explanations could be done better or something else. Just let me know. Any feedback at this point would be appreciated. Um, at this point in the course, we need to talk about consumer decisions, but before we go on talking about consumer decisions, I wanted to spend just a little bit of time talking about rational choice in general. So basically, I would construct a general framework for decision making, and then we will transform that framework for the particular needs of consumer decisions. This and the next two lectures will be following chapter 4 in our textbook. In addition, if you're interested, you can read chapter 3 in Varian. Both of these chapters are on Moodle. So when we talk about the theory of rational choice, the general question that we have to consider is how should a rational agent make decisions? And I want to point out that it's not exactly the same question as how do people make decisions, because basically we want to construct a kind of a best case model in which there is perfect rationality and the decision maker does not make mistakes, does not hesitate, and so on. And the reason we're working with this rational agent rather than a human being is that if we want to say something about the actual decision making of actual people, we need to judge it against the best case scenario. So we'll talk about the best case scenario today, and then next time you want to say that people are irrational, you'll have an ideal decision maker against which you will be comparing people's decisions. So the practical questions that we will look at in the next lecture, I believe, in the next two lectures, is what is rational consumer choice and how are individual demand functions derived? And so today we'll just lay the foundation for these practical questions. And before we move on, a note on notation: the theory of rational choice is the most general term, and consumer choice or theory of individual behavior are just the applications that focus on consumer decisions rather than decision making in general. Okay, so what are the components of choice? There are two components: the preferences that describe what is desirable by the agent, and the opportunities, that is, what is feasible. And the important thing here is that the preferences and the opportunities should be independent of each other. It means you shouldn't want or not want something because you can or you can't afford it. It might not be the case in the real world, and here's an example of when it's not. A hopefully famous quote by Groucho Marx, where he says that "I don't care to belong to a club that accepts people like me as members," is an example of a situation when feasibility and desirability are not independent of each other. But for rational agents, we want this independence to be in place at all times. Now, when we talk about preferences, we need to look at all possible alternatives that a rational agent is facing, and we'll call the set of all such alternatives Z, and we'll denote elements from that set with capital letters. And we need to introduce a preference relationship on this set that will basically allow us to do pairwise comparisons between alternatives in the set. So we can say the decision maker likes A better than B, and we'll in short write it as A is better than B, with the better sign looking like the greater sign in when we compare numbers. An alternative situation could be that A is indifferent, the agent is indifferent between A and B, and then we'll use the indifferent sign. So we'll want to summarize the agent's preferences, with the starting point being the pairwise comparisons between different alternatives in the set of alternatives. We will call preferences complete if the rational agent that we're looking at is able to compare any two alternatives in the set. So formally speaking, for any two alternatives, either the agent likes A better than B, or is indifferent between the two, or prefers B to A. And of course, if we think about real life, there could be situations when it's really hard to make such a choice. For instance, here's this example of the streetcar dilemma where the decision maker is the person with the switch, and the question is, should you pull the switch and kill one person to save 5 lives, or should you not do anything? These kind of decisions are hard to make, but we're assuming that the decision maker in our story is capable of making any comparisons whatsoever. The second thing that we want from preferences is that preferences have to be transitive. The decision maker must not have any cycles of preferences. A formal definition of this property of preferences is that if you're looking at 3 alternatives, A, B, and C, and if you prefer A to B and B to C, then you definitely have to prefer A to C. And together, completeness and transitivity allow us to basically line up all the alternatives along a line, and thus would be able to assign a rank to each alternative. So if an agent's preferences are complete and transitive, they can be described by an ordinal utility function. Basically, we can rank all alternatives if there are no gaps, the preferences are complete, and the preferences are transitive, so the decision maker does not go in circles. If that's the case, any ranking of such preferences is called an ordinal utility function. So a utility function is nothing else than a concise way of expressing preferences. It does not necessarily describe any pleasure or satisfaction or dissatisfaction that you receive from a particular alternative. It's just a numerical representation of your likes and dislikes. And so if the set of alternatives is infinite, we need additional technical assumptions for the utility function to exist beyond completeness and transitivity, but we won't go into details at this point. The important distinction that we should consider, though, is the distinction between ordinal and cardinal utility. When we compare the alternatives, one way to do is to just assign a better alternative higher number that will bring us into the ordinal utility world where only the order of numbers matters when we talk about the preferences. However, we might want to say something about how much you prefer one alternative to the other. And if we assign numbers to the alternatives in such a way that the ratio of the numbers tells us the relative preference of the decision maker, then we're in the cardinal utility world. And so with respect to the consumer decisions, we usually stick with the cardinal utility because that is more convenient, and that choice possesses more information. Unfortunately, neither cardinal nor ordinal utility representation is unique. Any assignment that preserves rank of the alternatives works just as well in the ordinal utility world. Any assignment that preserves the rank and the ratios of between any two alternatives works just as well in the cardinal utility world. Because of that, it is not possible for us to directly compare utilities of different individuals. Going back to the beginning, we've described two components of choice. Okay, so far we've talked about preferences, And we can say that the preferences are described by a utility function. Opportunities, on the other hand, would be described by some kind of a feasibility constraint, what you can get from the set of all possibilities. And given these two components of choice, what's left is to introduce the choice rule. And the optimal choice for a rational agent would be to choose the best feasible alternative. So the opportunities would determine which alternatives you can possibly have, and the preferences will select the best alternative among the feasible ones. So, formally speaking, a rational agent should choose the alternative with the highest utility among the feasible ones. And in the next lecture, I will talk about what it means in the context of consumer choice. Thank you.